In 1937, Upton Sinclair blasted the callousness of the Ford Motor Company at the time, worth $1 billion, that underpaid its workers while forcing them to engage in repetitive and sometimes dangerous assembly line labor. 83 years later, the market capitalization of Amazon.com has exceeded $1 trillion, and its sway over our economy and our society continues to intensify. Alec MacGillis is a senior reporter for ProPublica, covering politics and government. He reported previously for the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, and the New Republic, and his journalism has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Harper's, and other publications. The recipient of at least 3 awards, including the 2016 Robin Toner Prize for Political Reporting and a 2017 Polk Award for National Reporting. His ProPublica reporting on Dayton, Ohio was the basis of a 2018 PBS Frontline documentary entitled Left Behind America, about the economic and social forces leaving the once thriving Rust Belt city in ruin. He is also the author of a 2014 biography of Mitch McConnell entitled The Utterly Sincere Guardian of the Senate and Its Traditions. My bad, it's actually called The Cynic. Margaret O'Mara, sorry, I shouldn't be cracking jokes. No time for that. Margaret O'Mara is the Howard and Francis Keller Endowed Professor of History at the University of Washington and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Her research focuses on the high-tech industry, American politics, and the connections between the two. She's the author of several books, including 2019's The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America, a Financial Times and Publishers Weekly best book of that very year. You may recall seeing her interview with Joe Lepore for Town Hall Seattle just last September. We're grateful she's returned tonight to talk with Alec MacGillis about his latest book, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America. Please join me in welcoming Margaret O'Mara and Alec MacGillis.
Thank you so much, Ware. Welcome to Seattle, Alec. You're actually in a 3 hours ahead in a time zone. So first of all, thanks for partying with us late night in Seattle. And it's really great to have you here. One week since the book came out, and a really fantastic book it is. It's and so what I wanted to do is just open up and ask you why you wrote it. Tell us a bit about what you're trying to say with this book.
Well, let me say, first of all, thank you to Town Hall for having this event. I really wish I could be there. This book is about places, very much a book about place in America. And so it'd be great if I could actually be in these places talking about the book. But this is certainly something much better than nothing. And I'm grateful for that. And I'll be back for the paperback, hopefully. And thank you to you, Margaret, for moderating this. You're a great authority on the subject, and so it's really helpful. I set out to do this book. When I set out to do this book, it was actually not a book about Amazon. It was a book about regional inequality, regional disparities in America, growing gaps between places in America. I've been traveling all around the country as a national political reporter, starting in the Obama years, the Obama 2008 election, and then his early administration. And I'd be out in the Midwest during the Great Recession for these stories, and I'd come back to Washington and just be blown away by the incredible prosperity on display there and the disconnect with what was going on around the country. And I had previous experience with this. I grew up in a small city in Western Mass that has been just devastated by the departure of GE, Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and watching Pittsfield fall so far behind Boston, Metro Boston, as Boston kind of spiraled into its own kind of tech-driven prosperity, and then even closer to home, I ended up moving back to Baltimore 8 years ago, and just that gap between Washington and Baltimore, these two cities just 40 miles apart that have been growing so wide apart in prosperity and in their prospects. It's so unhealthy. It's such an incredibly unhealthy balance for both sorts of places, the winner-take-all places, the left-behind places, both end up with major problems as a result of this imbalance. And I want to write about this. Trump got elected. I thought, now I really need to write about it because it clearly played a role in Trump's election. I spent the next year trying to figure out the right frame to write about these regional disparities. And I finally settled on Amazon. And I settled on Amazon as the frame for two reasons, quickly. One is that the company is just so ubiquitous now that it's just a handy way to take you around the country because it's everywhere. It's just a very handy thread to sort of show you our America now and how we live. It works as kind of a symptom of where we are now, an expression. But then it's also a handy thread a handy frame because it is itself a driver of this regional inequality. It and the other tech giants have contributed greatly to this kind of regional concentration of wealth. Our regional concentration of wealth is closely tied to the concentration of whole sectors of our economy in certain companies. So it worked in both ways as a frame, and that's how I set out on this 3 years ago, and here we are.
Yeah, well, your book deservedly has gotten some really wonderful reviews, very well reviewed on all the major outlets. And I really appreciated, there was a particularly thoughtful one in the LA Times last week, which did say effectively, I think it said, Alec MacGillis has written a horror story, but it was very complimentary and said, basically, something bad is going to happen to the people that you introduce in this book, and that bad thing is Amazon. But it also points out another parallel. I think it's in this review that something to another product of Baltimore, The Wire, the HBO series, which was a series of human stories used to illustrate a changing political economy and a system of winners and losers, and how institutions had failed whole groups of people. So tell me how you found your people and kind of how you chose. Tell me about some of the people in this book, and tell us sort of why they are sort of good vehicles for understanding what's going on in the United States right now.
Sure. Well, the key for me in the early going was both finding the people and also deciding on places. And I wanted to have certain cities that were these sort of hyper prosperous cities that were struggling with the problems of hyper prosperity, and then some left behind cities and towns. It was very clear that that one of my cities was going to be Seattle. That was just clear from the outset, because I was writing about Amazon. You had a city that had been utterly transformed by this company. And then I knew I wanted to write about Washington, D.C., because it was also, to me, a very classic example of this type. And I wanted to write about that Baltimore-Washington divide. And actually picked DC as my second winner city, even before Amazon picked DC for HQ2. So that worked out very nicely. That was very serendipitous. Baltimore, I knew I wanted to write about because I live here and I've seen this up close, what's happened here. And then I've spent a lot of time in Ohio as a reporter. So I have various Ohio communities, Dayton and sort of rural Southeast Ohio, figure very much in the book, as well as left behind kind of places. Then when it came to the figures, the characters, some of them were people I'd already encountered in my reporting, and I knew that they were fascinating people, and I wanted to just write about them. And I knew that they had a story to tell. And in some cases, the connection to Amazon was pretty close, like the young man in Dayton, Ohio, who makes cardboard boxes for Amazon. He's in there. And the sort of story of his downward mobility, kind of embodying Dayton's downward mobility. So in some cases, the connection was a little more distant. A young man in Southeast Ohio who worked at Texas Roadhouse as a waiter, and sort of trying to save his rural town was another person. In the case of Seattle, I knew pretty early on that I wanted to write about the Central District and what had happened to the Central District, because I feel like that's a story that a lot of people outside Seattle are not aware of. A lot of people outside Seattle are not aware that the city had such an incredibly vibrant Black community. And we hear a lot about Black displacement in DC and somewhat in San Francisco, but it's registered less from Seattle at the national level. And so I wanted to write about that community and what had happened to it. And I've actually met with a whole bunch of members of the community on one of my early visits to Seattle, and then decided to focus on Pastor Wright, because she's just such a compelling person. Her story of the choir and not just her story of the choir, but also her expressiveness about her sadness about what has happened to the Central District, to me, was very evocative. And so that's sort of how it came to her. Another main character in Seattle is Katie Wilson of the Transit Riders Union. And I kind of came to her later as a character. I knew that as that whole tax fight developed in 2018, I was out there. I happened to be out there the very week that the vote to repeal the tax happened. It was all, very well timed and dramatic.
Mm-hmm.
And I met Katie at City Hall that day, and stayed in touch with her. And it was clear that among all the activists who were sort of working on that issue, on this whole fight to kind of deal with the housing problem, the homelessness problem, that she was, both out front in the fight and also very compelling in her own right, and also, and like Pat, very, very, very eloquent in how she talks about these problems. And then one other character I would just mention in passing, who's just incredible discovery for me. Back in Baltimore, I went to a union hall looking for people, retirees of the huge steelworks here in Baltimore that has been completely wiped off the face of the earth and replaced by Amazon warehouses. And I wanted to hope to find someone whose grandson or granddaughter now worked at Amazon, so you could draw the kind of generational connection there. Well, lo and behold, I make my request to this union hall, and afterward, 69-year-old man walks up and says, "You're looking for someone who works at Amazon?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I do." So this man, Bill Bodani, had spent decades working at steelworks, comes back to work for less than half the pay at the exact same place at this Amazon warehouse. And so that I build this whole chapter about the transformation of work in America through him and the story of the transformation of that site outside Baltimore.
It's really extraordinary. I think he was my favorite character in the book too. And I want to get back to Seattle, but first, just while we're on Bill Bodani and Baltimore, this is a book that you really dive deep into this longer history of what work has meant and what industry has meant. And Bethlehem Steel, which was the steel mill in Baltimore that's now the warehouse land, including Amazon warehouses, was sort of emblematic of another era in American capitalism in the way that Amazon is now. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of what was great about it and what wasn't great about it? I mean, sometimes we talk, when we talk about the new economy right now, the gig economy, and there's a sort of, we need to go back to the good old days of,
right,
a unionized workforce. Tell us more about what you discovered and the story you're telling about Bethlehem Steel.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. I was so blown away by what I found. And also kind of abashed that I didn't know more about this, because I've lived now more than a dozen years right up the road from this place, and I had so little notion of how vast and intense and extraordinary a place this was. At its peak, 300,000 workers, the biggest steel mill in the entire world, entire company town, 5,000 or 6,000 people right by the steelworks, like a grid of streets downtown, segregated downtowns, all that. And it became clear, that I never wanted to mythologize or idealize that work from the outset. But then as I was going to the research, it became clear how important it was not to do that, because the work was incredibly treacherous, incredibly dangerous. Just these descriptions of these injuries and fatalities and just the basic conditions, the extreme heat, the extreme just constant risk and just the gruelingness of it just comes through. And Bill Bodani himself suffered multiple injuries. That's why he finally quit, left the job after yet another injury. But what becomes clear as you're getting to the history is that things changed over time. At the outset, in the early 20th century, as the steelworks was still in its younger years, things were incredibly brutal. There was very little, incredibly low pay, very little, no say on the job, crazy hours, you'd get 2 holidays off a year, crazy productivity expectations. And then, of course, over time, they got organized. And through the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they finally got organized there. And the union came in, and things dramatically improved, across the board. Pay, greatly improved benefits, conditions, say on the job. Safety also improved because they just had more say in how things were being run on the floor. And then you also have big gains actually in the in the integration of the workforce. In the 60s, the workforce, which had always been heavily, not majority Black, but heavily Black, the Black workforce really kind of makes major advances, and then the American steel industry, kind of suffers its famous decline, especially Bethlehem Steel, which was very badly managed, in the latter decades, and it, completely just vanishes. I mean, by 2012, it's gone completely. It's so creepy. Like, you go over there now, and you're driving on this empty peninsula, and your GPS still says A Street, B Street, D Street, E Street. They're all gone. It's just this flat, tidal expanse. And now you have these warehouses, 2 Amazon warehouses, a bunch of others too. And when you talk to Bill Bodani about the difference in the work, obviously the warehouse work now is physically taxing and wearing in all sorts of ways, but is not as treacherous as what was experienced at the steel mill. There's just no comparison. But this one man, and many people like him, feel the loss of the first kind of work keenly, because as dangerous as it was, it paid a lot more, but more importantly, it just gave them vastly more sense of purpose and camaraderie and community and meaning in life. There's a reason why a lot of these men, mostly men, stayed there for decades, for their whole careers, not only because it provided a middle class kind of income, but also because they just felt part of something. And I was talking to another retired steel worker from there recently, and he commented on the fact that he still lives right near there. And he says, after the shifts now at the warehouse, you see all the guys the workers, men and women, go screaming out of there in their cars at the end of shifts. So they drive out so fast, like what tires squealing, they've had to put in big speed bumps. And people are just desperate to get out of there, get home, right? Like, you've done your shift there, your $15 an hour shift. It's incredibly, often very repetitive, very isolating kind of work. And you're out of there. And whereas, of course, back in the day, you often rolled out with your crew and, into the bar or the diner or whatever. And then you came in as a team. Like, this man talked about coming in, you felt like a fire crew going to work. Like, we're going to put out fires, we're going to roll steel today. You were part of something. And I brought this up in a recent talk about the book, and there was a worker, Amazon worker, called in, and he said, there's no way I'm going to leave work now and go have a beer with Joe. I don't even know who Joe is. He's 30 feet away, but I don't know who he is. So that's what the difference comes down to. And that's why I called the book, that chapter of the book, Dignity, because it's about that. It's about purpose and dignity and meaning in your life. That's what's been lost, along with the much lower pay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and Amazon's not the only kind of post-industrial big employer that has certainly gotten a lot of scrutiny and become a major, a disruptive force in redefining work. Walmart is another example. I mean, Walmart's got, this sort of similarly huge workforce, very contingent, similar models. Like why would you say, in what ways are the two similar sort of manifestations of the same phenomenon, but also in what ways is it different? Like, how do we see this model of the work in an Amazon fulfillment center, for example, different from these other new forms of work?
I think the difference comes down to a couple main things, and that have to do partly with what the book's main theme of sort of geography. Amazon had its whole own massive geographic destructive effect, on our landscape, which the famous, the devastation of Main Street, of all these small towns, small cities all around the country, but especially in certain parts of the country, just wiping out, helping to wipe out communities in that way, and it was so destructive. What Amazon has done to the landscape is slightly different, because while it's also contributing to the further, weakening of local retail and local sort of local business and all the sort of community and vibrancy that comes with that. And that's been, very well documented by, that the effect that Amazon itself is having in that way on small businesses. It then also has the opposite, the other effect that I write about in the book, which is that it's created this, the helping to create the winner take all cities where all that wealth and business activity is now sucked into in a way that didn't really happen with Walmart. I mean, Walmart is in Bentonville. It vastly enriched in this a large family, to sort of grotesque levels, and but you didn't end up with this this whole kind of, and it hurt all these, devastated all these downtowns, but it didn't end up with that, what we're seeing now in these last couple of decades with the tech giants, which is this incredible exacerbation of regional inequality through the sorting out of the winner cities and left behind ones.
Yeah.
And one more difference I would just note is, it's an important one, I think, as much as, I, know loss for Walmart, but one important thing to note about Walmart is that it pays a lot more taxes than Amazon does because of its physical manifestation, its physical business model, because it's simply not managed to kind of game the system as well as Amazon has, with Amazon's just incredible success, both at famously skirting sales taxes, through the sort of the online loophole for sales taxes, but then also managing to pay almost no federal income taxes by taking huge losses and keeping down its sort of paper gains. Walmart is paying billions more in taxes every year than is Amazon. So they're a blight, no question. But that is just one important difference.
Yeah. That, and I think Amazon's counter would be, well, we pay what we're just following the US tax code, right? We're following the rule. That's what the rules let us, do. And I think that comes to another sort of, I think, big underlying current throughout this story of regional inequality that you're tracing in this book, which is the role of politics and policy and what lawmakers at different levels of government have done over the last 40 years or to create and recreate pathways of opportunity. Can you talk, what do you think are the big takeaways in this book in terms of, what are the policy routes? What can you point to, sort of a moment, a choice made, and by whom, what party? I see culpability across the spectrum here in your story.
So the book is, it's not a sort of a policy argument book, or a thesis book. It's a reported narrative, but it definitely leaves one with the implicit impression that the biggest thing that we could do to address this problem of this kind of regional concentration of wealth, of this regional inequality, is antitrust, and that our lax approach to monopolies over the last four more decades has played a big role in this, and that just put it very blunt terms, the more that certain giant companies have come to dominate whole sectors of the economy, the more that just wealth and prosperity and business activity has been kind of hoovered into them in the places where they kind of reside, and that if we could deal with that problem, somehow break them up, rein them in, you just end up just dispersing some more wealth and prosperity around the country. I mean, retail is not the only example of this. The other example is what's been done to my industry of media, right? Where used to be ad revenue, which was the lifeblood of journalism, was spread all around the country, papers, local TV, local radio, whatever, and now we've moved to to a digital world where digital ad revenue is what matters most, and 60% of all digital ad revenue is controlled by two companies, Google and Facebook, and they reside in the Bay Area. And the Bay Area is, not only because of this, but partly because of this, is home to now dystopian levels of inequality and crazy wealth. And Amazon is, of course, gaining on those two in ad revenue. So maybe it'll soon be a triopoly, not duopoly. But that's just one example. And then retail, of course, is another. And the responsibility for that lax approach is across the board. It's started on the right, sort of in the 60s and 70s, in the kind of a sort of whole kind of carefully plotted attempt to overthrow our approach to antitrust and protecting the little guy. But now in recent years, it's become quite bipartisan. It was the Obama administration that presided for 8 years. Presided over this massive growth of the giants, lifting nary a finger. And the big question now is going to be, will the Biden administration be willing to take a different tack on this front than their Obama precursors did? That's going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah. Well, speaking of dystopian levels of inequality in the Bay Area, usually what ails the Bay Area, it ails Seattle too. Maybe sometimes we don't burn quite as hot, but we still burn. And you paint an uncomfortable portrait of our city, as it is now, our region. Coming in as an outsider, I mean, what did you see? What were your takeaways? What do you see as the biggest challenges for this place?
It really it knocked me out coming there. Like I'd been there before. I've been there way back in 2004, I think was the first time I came. And I just loved the city back then. I fell in love with it. I just couldn't believe, just struck me how much it still felt like a kind of a raw natural resource outpost. Like you could just you could still picture the logs kind of rolling down the hill from Yesler Sawmill, and you had the huge rail yards and the port and ships, and you could just still see kind of all the stuff kind of coming down from the Northwest and from Alaska and to this kind of frontier trading post. That was still, still some sense of that even then. And so then to come back for the book in 2018, I made several trips, and just that the wealth was just astonishing. I mean, it knocked me out. And that, but not just the wealth, just that feeling when you walk through South Lake Union and you just see just all that, the blandness of it, the buildings with the strange names, I got up into one of the buildings, and I saw that dog park on the 17th floor, this beautiful terrace and like this amazing view on the 17th floor. There's a huge, it's a dog park terrace. It's incredible. Like it's just it's also surreal if you're coming into it fresh. And then to go to the Central District, and I've been doing all this reading about the Central District. There's this great history of it by Washington State historian Quintar Taylor, and I found that book. It was amazing. I found that book in the Baltimore Library. I just stumbled on it. The Baltimore Library had that historical monograph about the Central District, and so I did all this reading on it. And then to come there and see it, just I thought I was in the wrong place. It's like this is it. This is the famous historically Black neighborhood. Like this was like no historically Black neighborhood I'd ever seen in any other city. Like this is like where it was just the extent of the transformation, just stunning. And then I was back again a year or two later, and for Moja Fest, and saw the parade going down the street. It was just heartbreaking. It was so poignant. This parade going down the street with all the new buildings and people just sort of sipping coffee up from their balconies, looking down at this sort of heritage parade for a community, that neighborhood that was just barely hanging on. And then, but what most struck me was the political aspect of it. Like what happened around that 2018, tax referendum, and how kind of easy it was for Amazon to tap into, as sort of an unpleasant strain in the politics of really almost kind of a liberal left version of Tea Partyism, of real anti-government strain of how, why should we raise more tax money to pay for housing and homelessness? They're just going to waste it anyway. They don't know, the government's all, it's all wasteful and ineffective, and why even bother, kind of, and then the conflicted feelings around Amazon itself, right? Like seeing that Amazon, that it had brought congestion to the city and transformed the city in ways that were not entirely welcome, but at the same time also knowing that it had brought this prosperity and had made your little bungalow that you bought for like 200 grand some years ago worth $1 million now, and just in a kind of a real kind of a pride in that, and in not wanting to kind of kill the golden goose, and just this deep ambivalence about the prosperity, and in a way like a reluctance to kind of to do anything that might somehow diminish it, even if it brought some more kind of balance to this incredible inequality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To see that in this very liberal city, that was just really striking.
Yeah. Well, it's got deep roots and multiple causes, and it's going to be, it's interesting. You didn't write a policy book. You don't end with prescriptions of here's how it's all going to be fixed. But I am tempted to ask you, because, as to again quote from the LA Times review, noting America doesn't have to be a horror story, right? So, we did have at the beginning of the 20th century incredible sort of concentration of wealth, the Bethlehem steals, the U.S. steals, this incredible inequality, and also geographic imbalance and sort of concentration of wealth in certain cities. Now, some of the cities that are now the left behind cities in your narrative. So I'm curious, kind of, and this is perhaps a Seattle question. I think there are probably a lot of people listening in tonight who are caring deeply about Seattle's future, both in terms of its, what prosperity looks like. And I think people have different ideas about what that entails, and recognizing that Amazon and Microsoft are two of our very biggest employers, as well as these other multinational companies that have, and there is a concentration of wealth, as well as these seemingly intractable problems. I mean, what advice do you have for, thinking about the sort of a different approach towards antitrust, but at the local level, what are some things that people who are living this and caring about this, what does one do?
I actually think that the key is actually not to think of it as local, and to really actually make the connection between the local problems you're dealing with and the national one. I find it really confounding how so often in the winter cities there's this whole bitter housing debate between kind of the left factions. There's the housing supply side, right? We just need to build more, and that runs into the NIMBYs who don't want you to build more. And then there's the kind of the rent control people who think we can just fix it by some kind of, just regulated limits. And that of course comes with its own problems. And it's this whole bitter fight. And I just feel like so often it was missing in that is the broader context, which is that this problem of affordability is being driven partly by this incredible concentration of prosperity and wealth in our country in a handful of places, in a way that is, it's hard to say. I don't know what kind of numbers we have for like way back in the day, but that we simply haven't seen in a very, very long time, if ever. Just as income inequality in our country is grown to these incredible levels, the 1% and all that, regional inequality also we simply were not nearly as disparate in between cities as we are now, and so I just wish that there'd be more of awareness of how one city's issue problems fits into that broader context, and kind of a joining of the fight on the national level. But I do worry that one reason that doesn't happen is that many people in these cities, while they're very worried about the housing affordability problem and all that, actually don't want to surrender any of their cities' kind of winner status. That they're actually kind of proud of it, and or maybe even see it as a good thing for like the world, to have so much growth concentrated in these sort of dense cities that are fairly, kind of climate friendly for being dense and all that. What that misses is that there are all these other cities out there that are also actually quite dense, and like, Baltimore and Cleveland and St. Louis are pretty dense, and you could have very sort of climate friendly growth and prosperity there. Whole blocks of row houses standing empty that are dense, and the fact that we're now, put it very bluntly, we are, in Washington, for instance, knocking down, figuring out what to do in a city where your average townhouse costs $700,000, $800,000, $900,000, if not more, and just 40 miles up the road, we're demolishing entire blocks of vacant row houses that, if anything, were nicer back in the day than the ones in DC, and that's madness. And but what happened just 2 years ago? Amazon put those 25,000 high-paid jobs in DC, not Baltimore, and so that problem's going to get only worse. And so it's all connected to that dynamic. But too often it's this very kind of more sort of narrow local fight that doesn't connect to the larger issues.
Yeah. So I want to bring in some audience questions, and if anyone has any questions, I encourage you to put those in the chat, and we will try to address. I'll try to address as many as we can. But we have one, a really, I think, an interesting, provocative one coming in here asking, is Amazon the evil player here, or is it technology / the internet? If not Amazon, others would be doing internet commerce. And Amazon pays $15 an hour versus Walmart at $11 an hour. Discuss. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm well acquainted with that argument, because it was actually the main argument that I got back from Amazon when I talked at length with them in the home stretch of the book, and that actually is their main line. It's like, look, internet was going to happen, e-commerce was going to happen. It just happens to be us that are in this seat right now. It could be someone else. It could be some company called something different, but it's not. It's us. It's Amazon. And that's true to a certain extent, but there are these larger structural things that are happening in the economy and technology. But I think we too often, we often kind of go to that structural kind of frame too quickly or too exclusively. The fact is, the company does have agency and responsibility, and for specific things it's chosen to do. It didn't have to do things in the ways it did. You go through all these different choices they made. Starting with a particularly aggressive approach to tax avoidance in all these different ways that the book describes. A particularly demanding workplace for their workers, to the point where it has, just the reports, again, in my story, the book has a lot of them, of just how high pressure the warehouses are. There's a reason why turnover is so high. There's a reason why a lot of people just can't hack it. It can be pretty unremitting. And the choice with HQ2, citing locations like that, they could have taken this as they're outgrowing Seattle, as a choice as a moment to try to address some of this regional imbalance in this country. Like, just imagine if they had said, you know what, we're going to do this. We're going to put HQ2 in St. Louis. Yes, we might not have like the greatest workforce waiting for us at this moment, but they'll come, and we'll build it. This is good for the country. And it's in the book. It's Nick Hanauer who, when I bring this question up, why not think of it this way. And he laughed at me. He said, you don't understand Amazon at all. You don't understand Jeff at all. This is not how they think. It's just, there's no notion of something that's somehow good for the country, the larger, polity. Yes, there are larger structural things happening, but companies made all sorts of choices along the way that made some of these problems especially dire.
Yeah. And well, it's also not just one company, but I would say this kind of idea of the notion that our growth and prosperity as a company is good for the country, and we just need to be heads down focused on that, is something that's cuts across the whole tech industry and has for quite some time. It's not didn't come out of and it's common across a lot of industries. It's sort of and also where the incentives are, right? What are the leaders of companies being measured on? Stock performance. So there's a real in this story of regional inequality, and I think Amazon's sort of a powerful, it's good connective tissue here, but this is about, a broader political economy of 21st century America. One of the other, and it's not just retail, it's also, you talk a lot about AWS, which is an incredibly important part of Amazon itself, and also is a big, Microsoft's a big cloud player. Google's working very hard to get up there. But that also has a physical manifestation and a footprint. Can you talk a bit about is that too? They're thinking broadly about this tech-driven, what's the implication of cloud infrastructure and the concentration of that, of those services in a few companies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole chapter in the book, and it was just because I knew I had to talk about the cloud as well, and really go to that world. And I went to that world in two main places: in Northern Virginia, which is Amazon and the rest of the industry's initial sort of big East Coast hub for data centers. Just this whole sprawl of them, kind of going out into the Piedmont sort of horse country of Northern Virginia, west of Washington. And then now increasingly also in Ohio. There's just, in the exurbs of Columbus, there's just this whole new kind of sprawl of them, and it's the eeriest thing to spend time in them. I mean, it was, it's hard to even describe just how huge and kind of aggressively bland and of course just utterly impersonal they are as places with. Impersonal, literally, there are almost no people working at them. They have only a few dozen people employed, which is why it's all the more striking that these local communities have just thrown tax incentives at the companies to build them, because they're only going to get a couple of dozen employees out of them. And they're super heavily guarded and sort of secretive. At one of them, I was kind of followed by an Amazon cop who kind of followed me all around, and with binoculars. It was crazy. And now, of course, there's the whole, the biggest question with them is really the energy, right? I mean, it's just, they are incredibly omnivorous, and the companies are making all sorts of grand claims to trying to, make them as renewable energy dependent as possible, but they're so far from that. And right now, one reason that whole big cluster grew up in DC is that there's all this cheap coal electricity coming right out of Appalachia. Same thing with Ohio. I mean, you've got all this coal still in Ohio, and so it's just there's this major reckoning around them that still has to occur when it comes to the energy part of it.
Yeah, it's sort of the doppelganger of here, because in the Pacific Northwest, we've got hydroelectric power, which is greener, but so it's easy to forget that the East Coast grid is very dependent on something quite different. So there's a political dimension to this. You talked about how the election of Trump was a catalyst for you to read to write the book, and I think a lot about the sort of intense geographic sorting of America, which you're writing about here, which is something that is new and that is different. You and I are great examples of knowledge workers who grew up somewhere else. I grew up in Arkansas,
Yep.
now a very
Yep.
red state. I live in Seattle, which is very blue, and there are a lot of people who are in the Seattle region who are from somewhere else. That's been part of its mojo as a knowledge work center. It's brought people in from elsewhere. And so that's, what is does this help us? How does this, again, if policy is part of the answer here, and finding common ground and common understanding, which I would say books like yours, although it is can be a very dispiriting portrait, I think this is giving for folks like me who live in Seattle, and don't have a window into what it's like to be in Dayton, Ohio. Right. What does that landscape look like? We cultivate empathy by understanding the lives of others. Is geography destiny? I mean, do you really think that a resorting, a kind of seeding the middle of the country with more coastal people and vice versa is part of the answer?
Well, I'm so glad to hear that you feel that sort of greater understanding of some of these people in the book, because that was such a big goal for me. I mean, I've been moving between these worlds for, last 10, 15 years now, quite a lot, and so struck by the disconnect between them, and just so wishing to somehow to better understanding between them, because it's so toxic what we have right now, and it did play such a big role in Trump's election, and there. As I say in the book, economic decline and resentment does not excuse racism and xenophobia. It's completely linked. They're fueling each other. It makes you more vulnerable to certain appeals. And the realignment is such a big. I think we're not really grappling yet with just how much of a realignment is underway right now. Just how much Democrats are they get skittish talking about like how much the party's become dominated by highly educated, upper income professionals in blue cities like Seattle and Boston and New York and DC. But it just has, and that's one reason the party has lost, a lot of its hold on the working class white voter, is that voter in Ohio looks at the people who now dominate the party, and they're like, and it's like, that's not me at all. Like, I'm completely not. I feel no relation to these people, and of course the Democratic Party still does have very strong support among non-white working class, Black and Hispanic working class voters, and what this is creating is this very kind of. It's an awkward coalition. I mean, it's what I've come to think of it as an Amazon coalition. It's all the people in the cities, the well-off upper middle class professionals, mostly white, who buy tons of stuff on Amazon and other online services. Did so even in much greater numbers this past year, and then the people who pack and deliver it to them. Like, that's sort of the Democratic coalition now. And that's a tough coalition to hold together. And in fact, you saw last fall, right, in Trump's loss, he actually made gains among working class Hispanics, and smaller gains among some Black men, but mainly among working class Hispanics. And you could see actually, it's not crazy to think that we might actually end up with it's wild to think, but it might happen that you could end up with a kind of working class Republican coalition that's not exclusively white. And because the Democratic Party has just become so much the party of these winner-take-all cities, and so that's a huge problem for the Democrats. Like, you can just barely scrape by in the Electoral College, but you're never going to get back the Senate in any kind of stable way, because the way the Senate is set up, and so I did write a piece back in 2016 before Trump got elected, actually, sort of urging liberals to repopulate the Midwest, but I still think a better way to do it would be to address the problem that the book describes, which is which is the regional inequality. If you can make Dayton and Toledo and Akron more prosperous cities again, there will be less resentment, and there will be less of that imbalance, and Democrats might actually just win the state again.
Mm-hmm. So you think, I mean, this is, I'm going to push back in part because I have, in response to a question that I see in the queue here, just questioning about this, economic decline versus racism and xenophobia, which clearly was something that Trump tapped into. Yeah. But Clinton, had a larger share of working class voters and white. There's a sort of the myth of the economic discontent, that those left behind voting for Trump doesn't totally track. And we've always had racism and xenophobia in America. Nationally, it's been a national problem throughout American history, particularly in times of economic upheaval. Will a kind of regional realignment help sort that, or what more needs to be done?
Well, it's a question of making. It's what's followed. What we've generally seen on the political map in recent years is that when certain places have experienced some kind of prosperity, and a spread where it sort of didn't exist before, that has generally made places bluer. So that's sort of what I meant by that. If you're a Democrat thinking, how do we deal with this problem with the map? One way to deal with it is not to write the places off, and not just not to write them off politically, but not to write them off sort of economically. And but as far as the class realignment, we have to be honest about this. Yes, the Republican Party still has all sorts of support among upper income voters, and there's still plenty of country club Republicans and plenty of business owner Republicans, all that's all true. But Trump, the reason Trump won in 2016 is that he did a lot better with lower income white voters than Republicans before him had done. It's there in the numbers. He did so much better than Romney. That's the Obama Trump voter, which did exist. There were quite a few of them. They were crucial, and then you had them, and then you had the people that he kind of brought in, non-voters that he brought in out of the woodwork, heavily lower income. And so you can cut the numbers a certain way, and it looks like that, yes, Democrats still do better with lower income voters, but Trump dramatically improved lower income voter performance compared to past Republicans. That's how he won, although he, of course, didn't really win.
Yeah. So, I think the economic story that you tell in the book is a really good, it helps explain why so many voters in 2016 looked at the Democrats and looked at the Republicans and looked at what those two parties had on offer to that group of people, the people in Dayton and Southeast Ohio and other places, and said, well, what the heck? Let's go with the guy who's promising just to turn the table over. Like, can't get any, can only get better from here. For these guys haven't delivered on our promises. It's a real indictment. But I think you tell the story really carefully. I think this is, one of the things, and I think this book will have a long tail. It's not just stick it to Amazon book. It's actually much more than Amazon, but it underscores how much Amazon has come to epitomize and be kind of a tail that wags the dog of a certain era of American politics and economics that is comparable to the great legendary companies of yore. So I appreciate that. We need to wrap up, but I want to just, I always like to, when I teach, because American history, it can be a bummer sometimes. So I always like to end on kind of an up note. And I was wondering if you have, what makes you optimistic? Who makes you optimistic? What, if from doing this book, writing this book, where do you see hope?
Oh, I definitely see hope in really just in people. I mean, there are, one reason I wanted to include certain people in the book is that I actually see them as hopeful people. Like I think Katie Wilson is a very hopeful person. She's, even after the tax defeat in 2018, keep fighting, and it actually the city now is ending up with another version of that tax, and the fight goes on. There's the young man that I include from Southeast Ohio, Taylor Sappington, an incredibly hopeful person who, this young man who goes back home, is at George Washington University on scholarship, doesn't feel at home in Washington, goes back to Southeast Ohio, Appalachian Ohio, runs for local office, has recently finally won local office. He's town auditor in his small town there. It's an incredibly poor town, but he's just working so hard at it while still working part-time at the Kroger and in town. And after previously having worked at the Texas Roadhouse, now he's at the Kroger, and he's also a town auditor, and he is helped uncover a huge local tax local fraud by his predecessor in the job, and it's going to bring us town a lot more money this way, and all these plans for the town. I just always find such hope in these people, and that's why I actually love reporting, is that you always are going to find these people, and that's why I actually don't get too down about all this, because when you actually meet the people and you sort of see the light in them and the spirit, and it's completely restorative, and it really is what keeps me going, and what fuels me to go out to find even more of those people.
That's fantastic. What a great note to end on. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Town Hall to take us out. Thank you so much for staying up late with us, Alec MacGillis.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thanks.
Great.
Thank you both so much. We really appreciate you spending this evening with us and talking about this really interesting topic.
Sure.
And also thank you to everyone who's watching from home. If you'd like to pick up a copy of the book, please do so through our bookstore partner, Third Place Books. There's a link in the chat, and have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again.